Welcome to our first Wild Ones River City chapter meeting for this year. I want to welcome all of you who are attending our meeting this evening. We welcome both members and non-members to our meetings because we want as many people as possible to benefit from the knowledge they gain from our programs. We hope that if you are not a member, you will consider joining our River City Wild Ones Grand Rapids chapter. If you'd like to join, simply go to the Wild Ones National website, wildones.org, click on the Join Now tab, and be sure to designate River City Wild Ones as your chapter. This past year, we had approximately 65 new members join our chapter. We are now up to 165 members. That is fantastic. More and more people are realizing that they can actually help save species, create biodiversity, and impact climate change while creating beauty in their landscapes. Our program committee, headed up by Linda Gary, our vice president, has organized some outstanding programs for us this year. You can find the list of upcoming programs on our website. Our March meeting on managing habitat for monarchs will be a Zoom meeting. Our meetings in April and May will be in-person field trips. For more details, check our website, rivercitywildones.org, for more details. In June, we will be celebrating our 15th anniversary as a Wild Ones chapter. This is an event that has been in the planning for the past 2 years and is going to take place on June 20th. Circle the date on your calendar and plan to attend. Linda, would you like to add any additional information about the anniversary event?
Sure, Marty. Thanks so much. We are so excited to celebrate 15 years of educating and advocating for native plants. And we hope that you guys will join us in June at Aquinas College for our celebration event. Our theme is Healing Our Earth, Small Steps to Make a Big Impact. There will be an expo with exhibits by local conservation organizations, and Dr. Doug Tallamy, who is a nationally known entomologist and an expert on biodiversity, will be our featured speaker. He will be presenting on his book, Nature's Best Hope, and he will be talking about the simple steps that each of us can take to reverse declining biodiversity. Dr. Tallamy is a great speaker, and I've heard him several times, and always I come away inspired and learning something new. So I hope you guys can come. You can attend the expo for a couple of hours before Dr. Tallamy's presentation. There will be great information about our local environmental issues and the many ways that you can get involved and make an impact for conservation in West Michigan. Thanks to our wonderful sponsors, this is a free event, but you do need to register. So we hope to see you there.
Thank you, Linda. I'm very excited about the upcoming presentation in June. We also have 2 walkabouts on the schedule at this time, and there may be more if there are any other members who would like to host a garden walkabout. A walkabout is not a critique. It's an opportunity for people to learn and see what you have done in that space you have and hear about your plans. We will have our annual plant sale on July 20th at the Fulton Street Farmers Market. This is our main fundraiser for the year. For more information will be available as we get closer to the date. Do you like a challenge? Have you heard of the Homegrown National Park Project? Many of you who have read Doug Tallamy's books or listened to his presentations are aware of the problem that our birds, butterflies, bees face. So, because so much of their habitat has been destroyed. On the Homegrown National Park website, you will find a call to action, and I quote, "We are catalyzing a collective effort of individual homeowners, property owners, land managers, farmers, and anyone with some soil to plant in, to start a new habitat by planting native plants and removing most invasive plants. It is the largest cooperative conservation project ever conceived or attempted." The initial goal is 20 million acres of native plantings in the United States. This represents approximately half of the green lawn on privately owned properties. This is a solution-based action of small efforts by many people. Together, we'll create new ecological networks that will enlarge populations of plants and animals, enabling them to weather normal population fluctuations indefinitely, end quote. The Wild Ones River City Board would like to challenge all of our members and guests to get their properties listed on the Homegrown National Park website. Our goal is to have Wild Ones members and friends lead the way in Kent and neighboring counties by getting Wild Ones members to list their properties. If you would like to join the challenge, we have on our website a link to a tutorial created by Linda Schuster, a member of our Wild Ones River City Board, which will help make your experience signing up go more smoothly. Please, if you haven't already signed up, sign up and join with others who know that this may be one of the most important actions you can take to save species, support wildlife, and preserve biodiversity. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Dave Warners from Calvin University. Before Linda Gary introduces him, I would like to share a personal experience. About 8 years ago, Dr. Warners invited a Wild Ones field trip to stop at his house so that we could see how to incorporate native plants in an urban yard. I had just moved to Grand Rapids at that time, and I was on that bus of visitors to his yard. After seeing how he had woodland plants in the backyard and prairie plants in the front yard with some lawn, I knew I could do it too. So thank you, Dr. Warners, for sharing your yard on that fateful day for me.
All right.
Now, Linda, it's time to introduce Dr. Warners.
Okay, thanks, Marty. So Dr. Dave Warners is our speaker tonight. He has been a speaker several times for our Wild Ones group on different topics, but we're excited to have him here tonight to talk about the Plaster Creek Watershed. But before I introduce Dave, there are some housekeeping items that I want to remind you about. Most of you have gotten really good at these Zoom webinars after the last couple of years, but just in case, I want to call your attention to the two buttons at the bottom of your screen. The chat button is where you can type in comments during the presentation. And that's also where we're going to post websites and other links that correlate with Dave's program. The Q&A button is for you to type in questions that you would like Dr. Warners to answer at the end of his presentation. And lastly, I want you to know that you will receive an email in a couple of days with a short survey and links to the resources that Dave mentions in his presentation. And it will also include a link with information about becoming a part of the Homegrown National Park movement. Okay, so Dr. Warner's presentation tonight is called Ken-O-Sha, Working for Reconciliation in a West Michigan Watershed. So this presentation is about the history of the Plaster Creek Watershed from around 36 million years ago to the present. And being able to look at this long history helps us understand how Plaster Creek has become such a degraded watershed and also what we can do to return it to a healthy living waterway again. All right, so Dave grew up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, graduated from Calvin College with a major in biology and chemistry in 1985. He completed a master's degree in environmental studies from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and then a PhD in botany from the University of Michigan. Between graduate degrees, Dave and his wife, Teri, lived in Tanzania and worked for the Christian Reformed World Relief Committee for a couple of years. He has been teaching ecology, botany, and research courses at Calvin for 22 years, and also doing research with students in conservation, restoration, and plant evolution. Dave is the director of the Plaster Creek Stewards, which is a community-based watershed restoration initiative at Calvin. The Plaster Creek Stewards works to reintroduce native gardens into urban and industrial areas. Dave has also been working with Garrett Crow on the Emma Cole project. Emma Cole was a teacher and a botanist in the late 1800s. And in 1901, she wrote a book titled Grand Rapids Flora. Dave and Garrett are revisiting and botanically evaluating all of the sites that Emma mentions in her book. So please welcome Dr. Warners. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks so much, Linda. Appreciate the warm introduction. It's always good to be with the wild ones. I feel like I'm among friends when I'm with you guys. And it's also just really nice to be able to talk to an audience where I don't feel like I need to convince you guys that native plants are really good things to plant in your yard. So I know I'm preaching to the choir, and I appreciate that. Tonight's presentation is going to give you some snippets that if you find this interesting, I'm right at the end of working on a book, and the book should be submitted to Michigan State Press certainly within the next month. And the book will, at least the working title is the same title as this talk. So I don't know if any of you have read William Least Moon's book called Prairie Earth, but it's a book that takes one county in Kansas and just does a deep dive into the history of that county from geologically right up to the present time, different people groups that lived in that county. And we kind of have that as a model for this book, where we're looking at the Plaster Creek Watershed and really trying to trot out its history. And the purpose for this is because we feel like to really understand why this creek got so contaminated, we need to understand the history of this creek. It's so counterintuitive to think that somebody thought it was okay to let a dangerously bacterial-laden stream flow right through neighborhoods where children are playing. How did that ever happen? And we feel like in order for us to really figure out some meaningful changes, improvements, we really have to understand what was behind the contamination of this creek. So I'll give you a little bit of flavor of that as we go. We have found history is really, really important for the current day work that we're doing and for the future that we envision for this watershed. Okay. So I'll give you a little introduction to the creek and then talk about the history, as I've just mentioned, and then talk about the emergence of this watershed group called Plaster Creek Stewards that I'm currently directing, and how we feel our work fits into the context of emerging area of ecology, referred to as reconciliation ecology. And then I want to show you some restoration projects that we've been involved in, talk a little bit about some of the research work that we've been doing, and then offer a conclusion. So here we are, Kent County in red there. And that's the digital elevation map of Kent County with the Grand River flowing right through it. So the bluer colors are lower in elevation, the red colors are higher in elevation. Here's the Plaster Creek Watershed. And it's about a 58 square mile area. So it's a manageable size. You see just to the right of the Plaster Creek Watershed, that's the Thornapple River coming in from the south, joining the Grand River at Ada. And then we also have the Flat River way over on the right, joining the Grand River at Lowell. One thing to point out is that originally these were the highways for Indigenous people, especially the Ottawa, who were known to be people of the water with their birch bark canoes. So, if I was showing this to Ottawa, they would say, yeah, that's a road map right there. We know those roads very well. What we have done is we've understood more history of the watershed, as we felt it's really important to acknowledge the people that lived in this watershed before we did. And so we've developed a land acknowledgement statement that I want to read with you right now. The Plaster Creek Watershed occupies a portion of the ancestral home of the Hopewell people from the Goodall Focus, and then more recently, the Anishinaabe Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations. We are grateful for the way these people cared for the land and loved it. We are informed by their teachings, and we strive to honor their example through ongoing education and restoration work. One of the things that really struck us sort of square between the eyes when we started looking at the history of this creek and the watershed is that this watershed supported healthy human populations for many, many, many years. And people lived here in this watershed, and the creek was in great shape for a long time. It was just only been recent when the people living in the watershed have really degraded it. And so we figured there's a lot to learn from the people who were living in the watershed sustainably. Not that we can all become, Native Americans again, but they have some lessons that they can teach us if we pay attention to some of their teachings and some of the ways that they lived. So introduction to the creek. This is a really destitute area of the watershed. This is up at Granville Avenue by Clyde Park. And this is where Silver Creek, one of the two main tributaries of Plaster Creek, joins Plaster Creek. And Silver Creek there, where that intrepid student is collecting some water samples, is emerging through a box culvert, a cement box culvert, after having been underground for 4 miles. So Silver Creek was put underground back in the 1940s because it was in the way of expanding the expanding city of Grand Rapids. So it joins Plaster Creek, which is in the foreground here. But what are the main problems with this creek? Flow dynamics is the big one. We talked about this being a trigger for all the other problems. So whenever the flow volumes increase, when the creek is carrying more water, it also carries more sediment, and it's carrying more nutrients, right? So the sediment and the nutrients are washing in from the land surface. And there's also thermal pollution, which I think is something that's underappreciated or under-recognized, especially in the summers. You know, Woodland Mall parking lot, Centerpoint Mall parking lot, these are in the watershed. So if it's a warm summer day and we get an afternoon thunderstorm, not only do we get a rush of water into the creek, but that water is really warm. And for aquatic organisms, dealing with that type of warm water is really difficult. And then trash and other toxic substances. There are several places in the watershed where we frequently find that people have just dumped large collections of trash. I mean, the creek is in terrible shape. And so I think there's a mentality that, you know, what's a few more bags of trash going to harm a creek that's already completely messed up? So there's there's a mentality for a lot of people who live in the watershed. And then bacterial contamination is a really big problem with our creek. You can't see bacterial contamination. So let me give you an idea from some plates that we have cultivated. So this was just some data taken back in 2015. This was taken at Paris Park. If you know the watershed at all, this is by 60th Street in the upper reaches of the watershed. And the way what's going on here is you take a little sample of water, and in this case, it was a 2.5 milliliter sample. And we mixed it with a medium that's referred to as Colascan. And then you shake it up with this medium Colascan solution, and then you pour it into a Petri dish like this. And the whole thing forms a gel. And you put it in an incubator for 2 days, and you take it out. And what happens is that solution has nutrients for bacterial colonies to grow. And then you can count the number of colonies that were in your 2.5 milliliter sample. And it also has some pigments in it so that the E. coli colonies turn purple as they start to grow. So on this plate here, you can probably pick off, there's one E. coli colony here, another one here. These red ones are different coliform bacterial colonies. They might be harmful, but they're not E. coli. And E. coli is kind of the measurement that's used for deciding if water is safe or not. So we got 4 here, and then there's another 5th one up against the side. And so we had 5 E. coli colonies for 2.5 milliliters of water. And when you do the math, that comes out to 200 colonies per 100 mil of water. And the Michigan water quality standards for full body contact, for safe full body contact, is set at 130 colonies per 100 mil. So at this point with 200, we're over what's considered safe for full body contact. So kids should not be in this creek at Paris Park on June 2, 2015. By the way, whenever we measure E. coli colonies in Plaster Creek in the summer, it's higher than what's considered safe for full body contact. But just to give you a sense of how much it fluctuates, we repeated this sample. And by the way, these are multiple samples. I'm just giving you examples, but we don't only just take one sample, we take multiple samples each time. This is June 12, 2015. And the only difference here, we had 10 days in between and we had thunderstorms come through. And so we had a whole bunch of water wash in from the land. And that was also a 2.5 milliliter sample. So you can see the E. coli levels just went sky high. This was a lot harder to count than 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, as you can imagine, right? So of course I have students that do the counting for me. But anyway, it comes to 24,000 colonies per 100 mil. And The state also has set a standard of 1,000 colonies per 100 mil, which is considered safe to touch. So we're 24 times higher than what's even considered safe to touch. And as I mentioned earlier, this is a creek that goes right through neighborhoods in the lower reaches of the watershed, right through Roosevelt Park where kids play. And so this is a public health hazard and endangering people, especially in the downstream reaches of the watershed. In 2000, when some of us at Calvin started to pay attention to Plaster Creek and getting involved in learning more about it, we heard from people in the state of Michigan, Department of Environmental Quality, that they consider Plaster Creek to be the most contaminated waterway in West Michigan because of all the sediment and bacteria in these extreme peak flows. Not a real pretty creek in most stretches. So we've gone from something like this, when you have native vegetation and trees, forested habitats along a creek, to an urban landscape largely, but also suburban and agricultural, but where we're trying to get water away from where people are as fast as possible. And so we've installed all these storm drains, and storm drains don't take water to the sewage treatment plant. They take it right to the nearest local waterway, which in Southeast Grand Rapids is Plaster Creek. So here it comes. Right. So the creek just gets way too much water whenever it rains or when you have snow melt. And the creek just doesn't, exist here in Southeast Kent County. It flows into the Grand River, and the Grand River flows into Lake Michigan. This is, we had some regional floods in 2013. And this is the scene in 2013 of Grand Haven, where Grand River is flowing into Lake Michigan. And of course, that's not all coming from Plaster Creek, but some of that is. And remember, some of the trouble in Lake Michigan is not what you see. It's a lot of that bacteria is ending up here too. So, I use this slide to point out, I don't think you need to be a tree hugger to see that this is not smart, right? This is where we get our drinking water. This is a hugely important recreational fisheries resource for people in West Michigan. And if we're living on the land in a way that results in this sort of contamination to Lake Michigan, it seems to me we ought to figure out different ways to live on the land. When you look at the history of Plaster Creek from the time that it formed, and this would be after the most recent glaciers, about 15,000 years ago, we realize that it's been on this downward spiral of environmental health for only about 150 years. So on that annual scale, if you set that to January to December 28 is when it started to become contaminated. So from January 1 all the way to December 28, 99% of its existence, it was healthy and thriving. And today it's life-threatening. One bit of hope I take from this is if people have messed it up in such a short period of time, maybe people can clean it up in a short period of time too, right? If we're capable of these negative impacts, how about it? Can we be capable of some positive impacts too? And the answer is yes, if we put our mind to it. So to give you an idea of the fluctuation of flow, this is downstream. This is right near Roosevelt Park. And this was a picture taken just before we had some thunderstorms come through. They dropped about 2 inches of rain overnight. And I went right back to the same spot and took a picture from the same spot the next day. And this is what the creek looked like. So that's a change within 24 hours. And it's not only the volume, but it's the clarity or the lack thereof. And you can't quite make it out here, but there's an oily sheen on top of the water as well from some of those automobile effluents that are wash in from parking lots. So, the question that's been driving us is, how did the creek get this bad? We feel like we really have to understand that in order to produce meaningful improvements. And then once we get a good handle on how it got this bad, what can be done to restore it? And, the first couple of years as we got working in Plaster Creek as Plaster Creek Stewards, I think we really saw our job is to clean up this creek. It's so messed up. And here we are, we're highly motivated. We're inspired. We're going to clean this creek up. And, it wasn't long before we realized that this polluted creek is really not the problem, but it's a symptom of a flawed worldview. So people living in the watershed are living under some false assumptions or some damaging assumptions. And so restoring the creek without addressing the worldview assumptions that have allowed and promoted this type of degradation will not have lasting impact. So we sort of re-envisioned our role, because we realized that to understand the worldview assumptions, we need to understand the history of this creek, and we need to really work with people. All right. We ourselves can't clean it up, because if we clean up this creek, check that off our list, walk away and find another creek to clean up. If the people living in the watershed haven't changed the way they think about their presence in the watershed, the way they think about this creek, it's just going to all get messed up again. And our changes will not be lasting. So we've really come to a different appreciation of what our task is. And it really involves as many people as possible and restoring a healthy relationship between people and the creation. So a little bit about the history. And as I've mentioned, I think it's so important to understand the history if we're going to create some lasting, meaningful change. 13,000 years ago, or 13,000 BC to about 500 AD, there were different waves of indigenous groups that used West Michigan. Sometimes these groups are referred to as Paleolithic Indians. A lot of them were just moving through West Michigan. Some of them early on were hunting the Pleistocene mammals that followed the glaciers as the glaciers receded to the north. But then it ended with this group of Hopewell, who were mound builders, and they were related to other groups. Hopewell were one of the most northern groups of people that were mound builders. And they're ultimately related down to the Mayans, who had the big pyramids down in Central America. So sort of came up the Mississippi Valley. So a really fascinating group of people. And we still have some of the mounds left over on the Norton Mounds along the interstate, between the interstate and the river. There was a larger group of mounds called the Converse Mounds that were completely obliterated during the construction of Grand Rapids. And a lot of the artifacts from those Converse Mounds ended up in Chicago Museum of Natural History and the Botany Museum in Boston. And some of the early settlers in Grand Rapids made quite a bit of money selling some of those artifacts. It wasn't until about around the year 800, that's about the earliest estimation I've seen, that the Ottawa showed up in West Michigan. And at the time the Ottawa showed up, the Hopewell were gone. It's not clear what caused the disappearance of the Hopewell. But when some of the earliest settlers came and encountered the Ottawa in West Michigan, they asked the Ottawa, what are these mounds? The Ottawa had no idea, but they revered the mounds. They treated them as sacred places. And they had tales in their own oral history of people that of very high advanced culture that lived in West Michigan before them. So they had a lot of respect for the Hopewell. The Ottawa were farmers. They cultivated maize, beans, and squash. Lots of decorative pottery, developed arrowheads, lived in wigwams, and their name for the white birch tree was wigwas. They gave them the wigwam. And then they also made amazing birch bark canoes. The Ottawa knew Plaster Creek as Ken-O-Sha, which means water of the walleye. And I'll get to the story of the name change in just a moment. Here's a really interesting sketch that we found in the archives of the Public Museum depicting early Grand Rapids and right about 1826. So 1825, the first Europeans settled in Grand Rapids on the west side of the Grand River. And the buildings on the far side back there are probably buildings associated with what was called the Thomas Mission, Baptist mission that was set up in 1825. And then in 1826, Louis Campaw showed up and he built a blacksmith shop and a cabin and a trading post. And those are probably those three buildings on the near side of the Grand River there. And you can see some Native American structures here in the foreground and some people fishing. And I think on the left-hand side there is probably Prunus americana grove. The Ottawa were known for cultivating wild plums, Prunus americana, that grow in this area. So a really interesting sketch here of early Grand Rapids. The story I want to tell you is a story between Chief Blackbird, who was one of the Ottawa chiefs in West Michigan. In fact, Chief Blackbird and his people lived in the Plaster Creek Watershed. And his encounters with the missionaries. Chief Blackbird was not very open to having his people be evangelized by the Baptist missionaries. He was very suspicious. In some of the research I've done, I realized there's some earlier encounters Chief Blackbird had with some of the white settlers that where he was not treated very well. And so he had a lot of suspicions about the coming of these white people. And he did not want his people to be converted into the white people's form of religion. And he had two real strong disagreements with the early missionaries. One was he did not understand why they demanded that people needed to go inside of a building to worship the Great Spirit, because the Ottawa were extremely spiritual people, but they encountered the Great Spirit in the outdoors. And the second thing that he didn't quite understand was why they said you have to read about the Great Spirit in a book. The Ottawa were people that didn't have a written language, so their tradition was based on stories and accounts. And so the idea that you have to read in a book about the Great Spirit, again, didn't make any sense to him. So there was ongoing tension between Chief Blackbird and the missionaries. And there's a story written by Charles Belknap, who was an early mayor of Grand Rapids. And he wrote this story in 1927, a year before he died. And this is a story that his father told him when he was a child. And it's about an interaction between Chief Blackbird and the missionaries. And in this story that Belknap writes, Chief Blackbird takes one of the missionaries into his canoe, and they travel down the Grand River to where Ken-O-Sha joined the Grand River. And then they paddled up up Ken-O-Sha to where there was a waterfall that flowed over a gypsum outcrop into the floodplain of the Grand River. And Chief Blackbird wanted to show the missionary this space because he said, this is where we encounter the Great Spirit. This is a sacred space for my tribe. And here's a picture that was depicted of one of the missionaries and Chief Blackbird. And there's the reference for this story by Belknap. And so I just want to read you a little bit from Belknap. So he writes, Blackbird ruled by inheritance the territory drained by the Ken-O-Sha, water of the big-eyed fish or the wall-eyed pike, which we understand to be walleye. And he goes on to write, the chief led the way to the canoe, holding the preacher's hand as in a vice, seated him in like a captive in the bottom of the canoe, which seemed guided by a magic paddle safely between the boulders in the riverbed. That's how Belknap spelled boulders. I thought that was kind of interesting. It is not hard to imagine the state of mind of the missionary when the canoe like a phantom glided into the wild woods, winding up the waters of the Ken-O-Sha, finally coming to rest at the foot of a cascading waterfall, brilliant in sunshine and shadow. A sample of that ledge rock was sent to Detroit, where geologists pronounced it gypsum. And when ground between millstones into fine powder, it was found to be valuable as land fertilizer. Advertised and sold as land plaster in the following years, it seemed easy to apply the name to the stream where the first rock was quarried and ground. So that sacred spot for Chief Blackbird's Ottawa was the first gypsum mine here in the Grand Rapids area. And by the way, gypsum was a really valuable resource to use for land fertilizer, and then later mixed with water to provide plaster for building materials. But at this time, gypsum was coming from Nova Scotia, imported from Nova Scotia for farmers. And so the discovery of gypsum right here in West Michigan was a big, big deal. I want to just call attention here that the name change of this waterway from Ken-O-Sha to Plaster Creek reveals a significant worldview shift that was taking place in the mid-19th century. So Ken-O-Sha identifies the creek by a living creature that resided within it. Plaster Creek identifies this water by a non-living resource that was mined from its banks. Ken-O-Sha provided food, while Plaster Creek provided wealth, at least for a time. Ken-O-Sha included a sacred space for worship. Plaster Creek became a convenient garbage conduit. As Grand Rapids expanded, raw sewage was dumped right into Plaster Creek. Ken-O-Sha was life-giving. Plaster Creek is life-threatening. So this name shift, there's a lot behind it, indicating a real shift in worldviews, in the way people understood themselves in relationship to the natural world. Those are some pictures on the side of that early gypsum mine and some of the devastation. So it was the first gypsum mine, 1841. By peak production in West Michigan, there were 13 different mines. So the Butterworth family was really big into mines. A lot of the area that now is Millennium Park was all mined. The first ones were surface mines, and then later they were subsurface mines. The waterfall was destroyed. The creek was rerouted, channelized. Also, the creek was used for running grinding stones to grind up the gypsum. And gypsum contributed inexhaustible wealth to the city of Grand Rapids. That's a reference from 1905. So this was an economic boon for this young, growing city. But it had devastating effects on the ecology of the region, and particularly the Plaster Creek Watershed. I also wanted to show you, to highlight the contrasting worldviews, just want to read two quotes for you. One is taken from a publication I found really, really interesting called Grand Rapids as It Is, published in 1888. And this was authored by many people who called themselves the Grand Rapids Board of Trade. By the way, that building there on the left is the original City Hall, which was finished in 1885. So just 3 years before this publication. And so this publication was put together and sent out to try to draw people to come to West Michigan and settle. All right, so it's kind of like a tourism brochure, if you will, although it's really long, not just a brochure. So I want to read an excerpt from this, and then I'm going to follow it up with an excerpt by a really interesting Indigenous person who was actually Chief Blackbird's son, named Andrew Blackbird, who wrote a book in 1887 from the Ottawa perspective of what was going on, right? So here's these two passages. First of all, Grand Rapids Board of Trade. It is known of all men that for many years, this state has been the chief producer of pine lumber in the Union. No other commonwealth has placed nearly so much nor so good pine lumber on the markets of the entire country for many years past. The gross product for 1887 was well toward 5,000 million feet, valued at $65 million. And this annual total will not be very largely decreased for the next decade to come. But yet, great as this wealth of pine has been and yet is, the hardwood wealth of the state yet undeveloped is greater than the pine wealth ever was. This hardwood wealth, consisting chiefly of beech, maple, oak, elm, ash, hickory, butternut, birch, basswood, and sycamore, is almost innumerable in quantity and unsurpassed in quality. There's also a vast amount of hemlock, cedar, and other evergreen timber wealth in Western Michigan. Grand Rapids is admirably located to secure the very choicest of this forest wealth. You want to make money? Come to Grand Rapids, you know? So this is the next wave. The first economic boon was gypsum, and then it's timber. And I'm sure you've heard the stories of the logs being floated down the river, et cetera. But man, there was a lot of money to be made from the clearing of the forests. And you can probably anticipate, Andrew Blackbird didn't see it quite like this. So Andrew Blackbird, History of the Ottawa and Ojibwe Indians of Michigan, 1887. By the way, he was a very well-educated person, and you'll pick up on that from his prose. So this is published 1 year before that section that I just read. Blackbird writes, "The land the Great Spirit has given us in which to live, to roam, to hunt, and build our council fires is no more to behold. Where once so many brave Algonquin and the daughters of the forest danced with joy, danced with gratitude to the Great Spirit for their homes, they are no more seen. Our forests are gone, and our game is destroyed. Hills, groves, and dales, once clad in a rich mantle of verdure, are stripped. Where is this promised land, which the Great Spirit had given to his red children as the perpetual inheritance of their posterity from generation to generation? Ah, the pale faces who have left their father's land far beyond the ocean have now come and dispossessed us of our heritage with cruel deceit and force of arms. Oh, my Father, thou hast taught me from my infancy to love this land of my birth. Thou hast even taught me to say that it is the gift of the Great Spirit. Oh, my Father, our happiest days are o'er, and never again shall we enjoy our forest home. Quite a contrast. Just to summarize a little bit, Indigenous Ottawa saw that people are part of the land. They are participants. Whereas European immigrants influenced by Enlightenment thought out of Europe saw people as apart from the land, as exceptional. The Indigenous understood land as filled with gifts to be shared and reciprocated. Whereas European immigrants saw that the land is filled with resources to be harvested and turned into wealth. The Ottawa saw healthy land will provide healthy people. But European immigrants considered healthy land to be land that's controlled, that's simplified and improved. In a lot of these historical documents, I'm really struck by how often the word improve shows up. And if it's a land that's forested, it's not improved. It needs to be improved by cutting down the trees and then planting corn or building a building. That's improving the land. And then finally, land is not owned. This is the Ottawa belief that, I mean, they just didn't have any concept of land ownership. They didn't think people could own land. They had jurisdictions over certain areas, but nobody owned land. And then European immigrants, as soon as you clear and homestead land, that conveys ownership. It's yours. It belongs to you. All right. Now, I'm sure you can sense from my comments here that I think there's a lot of problems with this enlightenment informed thought. I think we've been led astray and it's gotten us into a lot of trouble. And like I said, we can't become Indigenous Ottawa, but I think there's some principles there that we really need to pay attention to and try to unlearn some of the ways that we've been raised to think about creation and our own relationship to it, and allow that perception to be informed by some of the teachings of Indigenous people who lived in this landscape for thousands of years without destroying it. So one of the challenges we feel for Plaster Creek Stewards is to question these worldview level assumptions, identify them, and help people to reconsider different ways of thinking about their presence in the land. Right, so now let me tell you a little bit about Plaster Creek Stewards. We officially began our watershed organization in 2009. Our first grant was received in 2011. In those 2 years, it was brutal. We submitted 9 grant applications so because we wanted to do this work, and we were 0 for 9 before the 10th one came through, a $54,000 grant from the EPA, which was like the best Christmas ever. We were so excited. And then since then, you know, the grant world, if you get a grant and you carry through and you do what you said you were going to do, especially if you can come in under budget and on time, word gets around that you're a trustworthy organization. And since then, we've been really quite successful in getting subsequent grants. So to date, we're over $4 million in grants just over the last 10 years, which has allowed us to do some pretty big projects that I'm eager to show you. Now, here we are, Plaster Creek Stewards. Many of you people know some of these people. We just hired Benji Steenwijk as a greenhouse manager. So that's a new position. It's jointly funded through our Ecosystem Preserve and Plaster Creek Stewards. Julie and I are both faculty members at Calvin. And at Calvin, faculty are expected to do scholarship. And so Plaster Creek is sort of our playground for doing scholarship and research. Andrea is full-time project manager. Deanna is full-time project coordinator. Then Araceli and Anna are half-time with us right now. We also take on a lot of students in the summer. This was our summer crew last year. I should say this is not how they show up for work. This was a social time at Andrea's house. And she lives on the edge of a pond, and we had a lot of fun together. But we hire between 10 and 15 college students every summer from, students who are environmental, science majors, engineers, education majors, art majors. So it's a real multidisciplinary group, and it's great fun. Speaking of great fun, I also was struck by when I saw this picture, and you guys know what this is like. If you're doing restoration work, you rarely look like this with white shirts and big smiles. So I thought I would superimpose a picture of Deanna in the way that she normally looks, which is like this. This is hard work, when you're taking on part of the creation that's really messed up, man, it is hard to bring it back again. It's deeply meaningful and satisfying, but this is not for wimps, and none of these people are wimps. These are amazing people to work with. So I'm so blessed to be able to have them as part of my team. All right, our work, we understand, is fitting into this emerging discipline, what's referred to as reconciliation ecology, a term coined by Michael Rosenzweig out of Arizona State University. In 2001, he kind of introduced this idea in his book called Win-Win Ecology. And Michael says that we need to reconcile human uses of the planet with those of other species. So sort of a point that he focuses on is that he says around 5% of the Earth's land surface is set aside in protected areas for biodiversity. And around 95% then is dominated by the presence of human beings, one species. And his point is we don't need to do a better job taking care of that 5%. What we need to do is reconfigure the way we live in that other 95% so that biodiversity can come back and join us. And he refers to that whole process as reconciliation ecology. So focusing on human-dominated landscapes and then redoing them in ways that biodiversity comes back to join us. It's a powerful concept, and I think a very hopeful concept. So the way we understand reconciliation ecology as Plaster Creek Stewards is that we see it as the reinventing of the human presence to better accommodate, affirm, and fit into the landscape biodiversity which surrounds us. Reconciliation ecology is the science of restoring, creating, and maintaining habitats and conserving biodiversity in the places where people live, work, or play. That's what's key. So it requires, first of all, recognizing the problem of the way people have been living. And then secondly, acknowledging complicity, that we have been part of the problem. And then committing to trying to right the wrongs and moving forward in a more hopeful direction for the future. So our goal is a reimagination and reconfiguration of the human-human, as well as the human creation relationships. Another interesting insight that's emerged from our work is that we realize if people in the watershed got along with each other better, we think that the land would be in better shape. So one of the things we really try to do is introduce people in the upper reaches of the watershed where a lot of the contaminants enter the creek. So people who live in the lower ends of the watershed, where they have to deal with all the pollutants that are in the creek. And once they get to know each other, then the different things happen. People can change their behavior much more readily when there's a face to people who live in the lower parts of the watershed. So connecting churches, upper and lower watershed, schools, having kids meet each other. This has been a really powerful strategy for inspiring change. So we help residents develop a new relationship with their watershed. And instead of just us Plaster Creek Stewards leadership team trying to clean up this creek, our real goal is to provide opportunities for people to get involved. And in this way, foster a transition away from neglect and apathy towards tending and keeping. There's something, I'm sure you've all experienced it. Like I said, I'm preaching to the choir right now. There's something so beautiful that happens when a whole bunch of different people get together with a common focus and they work on a job together. There's so much goodness that happens at times like those. So to do this work, we grow a lot of native plants. We typically collect seeds from around 400 species, originally from remnant populations, but more and more now we can collect from our own projects in the watershed, which is really great. And we're up to around 100,000 plugs annually that we produce. We have 2 cold frame greenhouses, one called Asa after Asa Gray, the other Emma after Emma Cole. Asa greenhouse is a little older than the Emma greenhouse. If you understand botany in West Michigan, maybe you'll get that. If you don't worry about it. It's sort of a nerdy botany thing that we do. So here's some of our irises. I think there's some choke cherries or choke berries in the front there. Aronias. There's some silphiums coming up. You guys probably know how exciting it is when you got a whole bunch of plants at that stage. We have a native tree nursery that this year we're going to be expanding. It's hard to buy hickories and some of the native oaks from tree nurseries locally. So we're growing a lot of those trees ourselves. Here's some of this is our area where we harden off the seedlings before they go out to a project site. So I want to show you some projects now. And a couple projects on our own campus. So as you know, I made the point earlier that reconciliation ecology includes recognizing complicity. So Plaster Creek is fed by water that flows off Calvin's campus. And once we realized that, boy, we started looking at our campus in a real different way. Huge lawn areas, big parking lots, and asking what can we do about these places. So this is one of the projects we did behind our preserve house, big area of lawn that we took out. And this water is coming down slope, and then we channeled it into this little tributary that we had some check dams on. So we slowed the water down, tried to allow it to percolate in, and then of course filled it all with native plants. And get another view. So the water is heading towards us, and then underneath this road that I'm standing on when I took that picture. But before, it was flowing off of lawn. And once we have this bioswale in, now the water that flows underneath into this culvert is of much lower volume because it's slowed down so much by all these plants, and those plant roots are taking it up and transpiring it out through their leaves. And the water that does make it through this bioswale is a lot cleaner because it's been filtered out. So not to mention the fact that this is a fantastic place for butterflies and birds. So it has all sorts of biodiversity benefits. Here's a place right on our main campus, right outside our science building, where this area was all lawn. In fact, the area was lawn up to the wall. And then we have sort of creeped out. And at this the time of this planting, we surrounded this storm drain and filled it with native plants. And this has become such a cool little place. If you have, a native planting of any size, or maybe your yard, you know what I'm talking about, but things show up here that we never planted. I know ants have been moving some of the spring wildflowers into here, and birds have been bringing things in. So, you started out and you pull some weeds and, you coax some native plants along. But after a time, it takes on its own identity. It's almost like it's like its own organism. I mean, I'm eager this spring to take a good look at this spot because I'm right outside my office. But what's going to be in there new this spring that I haven't seen in there before? And it's just so fun to see nature be natural, We've thrown some seeds in here that have grown. And so we've got Virginia bluebells coming up in this nice little woodland planting. Dutchman's breeches, which if you know anything about Calvin, it's very appropriate that we have Dutchman breeches on our campus. One of the faculty members loved this area so much that they bought a bench to put out there, which is a very popular spot in the springtime. The bench is made out of recycled plastic, which is really cool too. This is a really beautiful spot for biodiversity right on our main campus. So much better than just if this area was all lawn. By the way, we don't have to mow it. We don't have to blow it. We don't have to put any herbicides, no sides of any type. I know you guys know this, but it just makes so much sense, right? It saves money. It absorbs carbon. It cleans water. Why are we not doing this all over the place? I think we will be. I think we're heading in that direction. I was sitting out here one fall day procrastinating some grading, and I was really struck by the Saldago Bridgeta that was out here and all the insects. This is one plant, and within a half hour, I took all these pictures just on one single plant. You know, these native plants are such magnets for biodiversity. It's magical. You know, all we have to do is plant the plants, and then the insects show up, and the birds, and the spiders, and etc. Okay, so there's a couple projects on our campus. There's more on our campus I'd love to tell you about, but for the sake of time, I also want to tell you about these curb cut rain gardens that we've been doing. I got this idea first from Grayling, Michigan, where Trout Unlimited had done a number of these to keep stormwater out of the Osable River. And so we started a program. This was back in 2015. Our first ones were put in, and to date, we've got over 100 of these now in Grand Rapids. So we take the lawn out between the sidewalk and the street, and then the water that's coming down the gutter headed towards one of those storm drains, we cut the curb away, and so we redirect the water into this dished out area filled with native plants. And so we're capturing that water before it can go down the storm drain into the nearest tributary to Plaster Creek. So these have been really popular, and we've got a long waiting list of people who want them. And it's been a really exciting project. Maybe one quick thing I can say is that we had an engineering crew look at these one summer, and they were looking at the amount of volume that one of these curb cut rain gardens actually captures. And they did some modeling, as engineers can do. And they modeled pre-settlement, how much 2-inch rainfall over a certain area of Grand Rapids would capture, or how much rainfall would end up in the creek pre-settlement time. And then they modeled how much rainfall, when you got all these houses and neighborhoods, would end up in Plaster Creek. And then they started playing around with curb cut rain gardens and started asking the question, how many curb cut rain gardens do you need in a neighborhood to get it back to pre-settlement volumes of water getting into Plaster Creek? And their answer was 1 in every 8 houses needs a curb cut rain garden. And we're back to volumes that are pre-settlement, that are quote unquote natural. And so it's not like every single person needs to have one of these. We just need 1 house out of 8 in our neighborhoods to have a curb cut rain garden. So that was so exciting to hear. I mean, we don't have near that, of course, but it's something my brain can process, right? I could see 1 in 8. And actually on some streets, we're pretty close to that. Here they are. I mean, it's beautiful. And we're doing some research trying to understand which native species do best in these curb cut rain gardens, because they get salts, you know, and they get a lot of road grit. And so not all native species tolerate this novel ecosystem as well as others. So if anybody's interested at all in papers, scientific research papers where we've, you know, trotted out some of this stuff, feel free to email me. I'll be happy to send you PDFs. We give each homeowner these are always done in cooperation with the homeowner. We give them each a map to show them what was planted where. In fact, if they want, they can help select which plants they want in their curb cut rain garden. So we really try to get buy-in from the homeowner. And then we work with them for 2 years to maintain it. And then after that, they're on their own and they have to maintain it, or they can hire somebody to do maintenance. We've also done a lot of projects at houses of worship. And we started Plaster Creek Stewards with 4 churches that were sort of these initial efforts. But more recently, we formed a partnership with National Wildlife Federation. They have a program called Sacred Grounds, where they're trying to get houses of worship involved in planting native pollinator gardens. And so we just modified that a little bit to have native rain gardens in the Plaster Creek Watershed. So as part of this, National Wildlife Federation will give a house of worship a grant, $1,500, towards the design and construction and then planting of their garden. And so we've done projects at 19 houses of worship with National Wildlife Federation since 2018. One of which was a mosque, the Masjid at Tawhid Mosque on East Paris, which is that picture in the center. Talk about meaningful interactions where you have Christians and Muslims and atheists coming together because there's a common concern for the creek. That's been some of the most meaningful work that I've been involved in with Plaster Creek Stewards. Really hopeful. And we also have a green team, a summer green team. We learned about similar programs at a conference we were at. I think it was back in 2012 in Washington, D.C. I went to a talk by two guys, one from Atlanta and one from DC, and they were talking about this high school program that they're both doing, watershed-based high school programs. And man, I just thought that was the coolest thing. And the guy from Atlanta had one of his participants there talk about her experience. And it was just so convicting. So we came back from that conference with this dream: could we get a high school program in the Plaster Creek watershed? And we did, and it's been amazing. So every summer we hire kids that they have to live, work, worship, or attend school in the Plaster Creek watershed. Some of these kids are rural from the Dutton, Caledonia area. Some of them are urban from the inner city parts, Roosevelt Park, et cetera. And so here you go. Kids get to know upstream, downstream people, and they work together at trying to restore the stream by helping us plant rain gardens, helping us collect seeds. They enter into all aspects of our restoration work. So I was nervous that it was going to be kind of like babysitting, but these kids have been terrific. They really do work hard, and it's just been such a delight. So we also have two college students mentor as part of the program. I think you can see my cursor. Here's Caleb and Gia were our two mentors last summer. And then Rachel was our supervisor of the program. But the college kids work right alongside the high school kids. And so the high school kids get to know a college kid, and they talk to them about going to college. If you thought about going to college, we have somebody from Calvin's Financial Aid come and talk to them over lunch. So we're also really trying to get these kids to be more likely to attend college or university than if they hadn't done this program. All right, two other projects I want to quick show you, and then I'll stop and open it up for questions. Calvin Avenue Basin. This is a big overflow area for Silver Creek, which is that tributary that's underground for 4 miles. And what's happened is over the years, with more and more impermeable surfaces, the pipe and the culvert that creek is in would reach capacity, and that would cause problems. And so there were some large areas that were set aside to handle the overflow when we get heavy rains, and this was one of them. So you can't see too much from this picture on the left, but that's a slope going down towards Silver Creek, which goes through the middle of this, and it comes out of a big pipe and then it goes back into a big pipe. So this is kind of like just a big release valve for Silver Creek. And here's on the right is a aerial view of this basin. Here comes the creek through the middle of it. And it was all lawn. And when they could get in there and mow, they would. So what we did is we got a grant from Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, because we had a sense that we could hold more water back in here. And so this is what we did. We got some engineers together with some excavators, and we designed a whole bunch of pits and mounds, is what we called them. So more water gets captured now and percolates into the ground instead of just flowing down those slopes into Silver Creek and out to Plaster Creek. So the amount that makes it to Plaster Creek through this whole system is much lower in volume. And of course, we planted this whole basin with native plants. And we had help from our green team and our college crews. And in these pits where we've got standing water, not all the milkweed is always a really good into like this. Desmodium canadense, the short-tipped trefoil. So this has been a really exciting project. We're going to focus on it again. I mean, there's so many weeds that come into places like this. You got to keep at it and try to tip the scales in favor of the natives. So we'll be doing a lot of work in here again this coming summer. And then the last project I want to show you is Shadyside Park. It was started in 2018. Here's Plaster Creek going through this Kent County Park. And you can see lawn right down to the edge of a stream that has high fluctuations in flow is not a good idea, because the lawn grasses don't have very deep roots. And so what do you do in a situation like this where there's incredible amounts of erosion and real estate literally just flowing right downstream and causing lots of problems for fish and aquatic organisms. Well, what you do is you peel back those banks. And what we want, it might be a little counterintuitive, but when this creek starts to fill up, we want it to overflow, all right, into a floodplain. So we've created a floodplain now where it overflows more frequently than it did before. Because when it overflows into a floodplain, the water slows down, and slower moving water can't carry as much sediment. And so sediment then drops out in the floodplain. And of course, you fill the floodplain with native plants. And so you have all kinds of biodiversity benefits, but the plants are also transpiring water, et cetera, et cetera. So we're basically recreating a floodplain. And this was, around about a $600,000 project. And we put in 70,000 plants into this project, over 200 trees. So this was the largest project to date we had done. We're involved in a major floodplain restoration this coming year as well, which will be similar in size. But here's some of the pictures. It also helps when you have lots of volunteers and students with young, strong backs. All right, this is 2020, what that floodplain restoration looked like. There's the trees that are put up on the shoulder. And you can see now when that creek comes up, it flows over into the floodplain where there's all kinds of plants that slow it down. A lot of sedges are in here, bulrushes. And this was last summer. This was right after there were some pretty major rainstorms coming through West Michigan. And what you see on the left there is the floodplain, and look at all the sediment in there. The plants are beaten down quite a bit, but man, they came back just great. And the other thing that was so encouraging to see is look at on the right here, the main channel has gravel bars. And this section of Plaster Creek had not seen gravel bars for at least a decade. I mean, the whole time that we've been working. And so maybe it's been decades since there have been gravel bars. It's just been chock full of sediment all the time. And gravel bars are way better habitat for macroinvertebrates. And so this is a healthy looking stream when you have gravel bars like that. And in fact, when we were there in July, there was a really nice big water snake who was hunting the gravel bars, which we had never seen before either. So this was a really exciting sort of observation that when you start treating creation well, it will respond. It will come back. And this was in October of 2021. So this is starting to look like a floodplain ought to look. Right? And the sound from the insects is just incredible. And the birds, they're in there eating the seeds. All right, I'm not going to talk about research. I could do a whole nother seminar on research, but we've had a lot of engineering research done in relationship to Plaster Creek Stewards. There's an oral history that was done. 85 senior citizens were interviewed, and their interviews were recorded. So a lot of their memories about when they were kids, their interactions with the creek. Chemistry, of course, for water quality, microbiology, trying to understand the E. coli, and then lots of biology too with native plants and native trees, which ones are the best ones to plant in different situations. All right. So my summary here, everyone lives in a watershed. As soon as you're out of one watershed, you're in another one. And many of our urban watersheds need a lot of help and care. Plaster Creek Stewards is working to reintroduce residents to their watershed, trying to establish healthier relationships between people and the creation. Urban spaces can draw back native biodiversity. We've seen it. When you treat it well, when you plant those native plants, the insects show up, the birds show up. And people can relearn to fit into creation better instead of imposing themselves onto creation. We've had so many amazing volunteers who show up to everything that we do. They've basically been converted, and it's so exciting and inspiring to see. And also caring for each other and the land goes together in reconciliation ecology. Getting to know our neighbors and caring about our neighbors will influence the way we treat the land. And then do unto those downstream as you would have those upstream do unto you. Good old St. Wendell Berry. And thank you. for coming today and for paying attention to my talk.
All right. Hey, well, Dave, that was such an awesome presentation. Oh my gosh. I am so inspired by all the things that you guys are doing. It's just so cool to see the before and after pictures and everything.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I'm not seeing a lot of questions here. There's a lot of comments in the chat box about wonderful presentations, so inspiring, all of that. But I'm not seeing a lot of questions. I guess, Mike, I have a question for you.
Sure.
If we wanted to volunteer with you guys, I assume that's on your webpage or something about ways
Yeah,
to.
for sure. And people can also just, I mean, we're small enough. People can just send me an email and say you want to get on our volunteer list. We don't bother you very frequently, but we let you know when there are opportunities. And
Okay.
so, yeah, I'm dwarners@calvin.edu.
Okay.
And you can also check out our website, just Google Plaster Creek Stewards, and there's opportunity there to sign up too.
Okay. That's so great. Yeah, I had heard reconciliation ecology before, but you gave it a whole new meaning here tonight.
Oh, great.
So
There's also, I'll just mention too, it's also kind of a synonym for what's being called sustainability studies. So a lot of colleges, universities have programs in sustainability studies, and it's basically how can people live differently on the land in more sustainable ways, where the rest of biodiversity can come back and join us. So yeah, I think there's a lot of hopeful things happening in these areas.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, we've had a question that has popped up. It's from Sue. She says, what plants do you recommend for a new planting near swamp-like areas?
Yeah, people who know me, I mean, I love sedges, and sedges are underappreciated. A lot of sedges are hosts for moths, are native moths, which I think are completely underappreciated. But you can't go wrong by planting some wetland sedges and bulrushes. But then for people who like more colorful things, swamp milkweed is such a good plant, and it will tolerate drying out from time to time. It's quite forgiving in terms of soil chemistry. So swamp milkweed is a really good plant to plant in wet areas too. We have lists on our website as well for different habitats. So feel free to take a look at that. It's almost like asking which child do you like the best. I mean, there's so many good plants to recommend. And but boy, the milkweeds are so good for butterflies, monarchs, and others. So you can't go wrong with milkweeds.
Yeah, very good. All right, a couple questions we've got coming on here. So this is from Andrew. He says, I'm curious, how do you approach having people gain a different worldview towards sustainably living in harmony with nature?
Yeah, you know what? That's
it's a big one.
You got to talk about it. You got to be respectful. Nobody likes being browbeat or guilted into anything. So I think engaging in conversations with people, asking questions, do you think your lawn really needs another dose of fertilizer? Do you know where the water goes when it leaves your property? Questions are a wonderful way of engaging people in conversation, I think. So I think, Andrew, in response, I would say, conversations, careful conversations, respectful dialogue, that kind of thing. And also demonstrations, I think, I showed you some of those plantings on our campus, and I don't want anybody to get the sense that everybody at Calvin is super excited about what Dave's been doing with some of these plantings. I mean, there's people who think those things look so messy. Why don't we take care of them? Why don't we mow those areas? I've had people tell me, we landscaped our newest dorm with all native habitat. We put a forest in around the dorm instead of lawn. And I've had people, in all honesty, tell me they think it sends the wrong message to visitors because it looks like that's an abandoned dorm, that nobody cares. And so I see that as an opportunity to have a conversation. This actually shows that we do care very much. We care way more than if we had put a lawn in. And you can ask the question, what do you care about? Those sorts of things. So boy, having conversations, I think is the best way to proceed forward. And then, using your own yard, your own lifestyle as examples to demonstrate your own convictions, I think is a good way to follow up those conversations.
Yeah, respectful conversations are important for anything these days, it seems like.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Jenny Wanty says, how do you go about getting residents of Plaster Creek to join you?
Yeah, so we recruit through the churches a lot. We have right now, when we do a major project, we always invite people in the neighborhood to come and join us. When we do curb cuts, we let the neighbors all know that we're going to be planting that curb cut on a certain day. If you want to learn more about it, come out. So we have these little doorknob hangers that we put on people's doors. We knock on doors and talk to people. So it's a lot of boots on the ground, interacting with people in the neighborhoods and then letting them know. We have signs that we put at our plantings too. And then there's information there about contacting Plaster Creek Stewards. So, and then word of mouth, people talk to each other. It spreads that way too. But so kind of all the above. But a lot of it is, being out there in the neighborhoods, having conversations with people and answering their questions. So,
I wonder if you're out there working, people might just stop by and see what you're doing, ask about.
yeah, for sure.
So,
When you show up with a bunch of students, people get curious. And I will say too, we've had some unfortunate interactions where people are quite belligerent and very critical. And so it's not all fun and games. And many of you, if you're trying to promote native plants, I'm sure you've had some pushback.
yeah.
I think you have to be careful, but I think you can take pushback as maybe a positive sign that you're heading in a good direction.
Yeah.
So on my better days, that's how I interpret those interactions.
Yeah, it's good to be optimistic that way. So that's good. Yeah. So Jennifer was wondering, she says, I'm in Cold Brook Creek. Are there any programs in this watershed?
Yeah, so I think West Michigan Environmental Action Council has been involved with Cold Brook Creek. So they're a wonderful organization and it's more expansive than just Plaster Creek Watershed for sure. So I would encourage you to get in touch with West Michigan Environmental Action Council and see what they've got going and see if you can join their efforts.
Okay, all right. Oh, and the last thing, so Andrew asks again, do you have any outreach in the local media? I'd love to see a weekly, monthly nature niche on a local TV news program. So add that to your agenda.
All right, great idea, Andrew. Thank you very much. Nature niche, it's got a ring to it. Right.
Oh man. Well, all right. I'm not seeing. Wait a minute. More questions on this side. Let's see. All right. Valerie's asking, thanks for this wonderful presentation. I have a question about recreational use. Our family often uses the mountain bike trails by the creek. What kind of impact do these trails have? And how can mountain bike groups contribute to the success of the creek?
Yeah, great question. We have worked with a mountain bike group at putting in trails in the Ken-O-Sha woods. And, my own preference, I'm not a big mountain biker. I would have preferred that they just keep the trails out of there and leave it alone. But once the decision was made to put some mountain bike trails in there, they were very open to working with us to route the trail in ways that were avoiding some populations of some rare plants. I think the best way, and it's great, right, to get people out into the woods. Anytime we get, especially kids outdoors these days, that's a plus for sure. So I don't want to sound like I'm a old grumpy old man, but I think when those bike trails are in there, keeping the bikes on the trails is probably the most important thing. And that's also good for wildlife. They get used to human movement when it's consistent. But when people start going off trail or taking a shortcut between this section of trail and this one, then that's creating a lot more damage. So I think being respectful and staying on the trails is the best thing that can be done. But also just taking kids out and getting kids out into the woods, man, that's really, really important.
Yeah, get them off those screens, get them outside.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Wendy says, we live on Plaster Creek behind Samaritas, very junky woodland. We love to do native plantings, especially for butterflies, birds, and insects, but we also have an extremely robust deer herd.
Yeah.
What can we do for this area, or just let it go?
We're learning. We've got a list of plants that deer don't seem to like. And as soon as I get really confident, I'll put some of those in, and then the deer in that area actually do like them. So I know it's hard, but boy, there are some species, spirea, our native spirea, also called meadowsweet. Spirea alba is one that the deer don't seem to go for. So Wendy, I'd be happy to talk with you or email with you back and forth about some plants that the deer are less likely to eat. We could put it that way than others.
Okay. All right, good. And last comment, Diane says, can we just change it back to the Indian name?
Oh yeah, you know what? We've looked into that a little bit. I think I would get a lot more serious about that once I see walleye coming up to spawn. So there's a hopeful thought. But to name it Water of the Walleye when it doesn't have any walleye in it seems a little premature. But I don't think there was ever any official name change that was done. It was just colloquially, so I think we could change it back, but we're waiting for that hopeful day when we see walleye in the creek.
Yeah, maybe not so far in the future there. So
yeah, I'd like to think in the next decade or so.
Yeah,
we'll see.
Yeah. Well, all right. Just a few last things. We're kind of out of questions, but thanks again, Dave.
No, my pleasure.
Great presentation, and it's so interesting to learn about the history and the work that you guys are doing. It's so inspiring. So thanks, and thanks to all of you who are watching. This is just the beginning of some great programs that we have here at Wild Ones River City. Our March program is also a Zoom presentation. Dr. Nate Hahn will be talking about managing habitat for monarchs. And as Marty mentioned, we have some great field trips coming up with the warmer weather. If you're interested in joining us for our 15-year celebration event, that registration will open on June 1st. And don't forget about our annual native plant sale in July. And I guess we should find out about what your date is there at Calvin, Dave, for your native plant sale.
It's the first, I want to say it's the first Saturday in May.
Okay, first Saturday in May for
Yes.
the Calvin sale, and then ours is in July. But we'll have details about all our events on our website. And yeah, I think that's all I've got. Thanks again. It's good to see everybody. And yeah, we'll see you guys hopefully in March. And Dave, good luck. Continue that good work. Good
All
night.
right, thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you very much. All right, so long.
All right. Bye-bye.